Something I read recently in the Indian Express really caught my eye.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
It was about a protest down in Hyderabad. Some land, forested land, was up for auction.
Ah, right.
And it just immediately made me think about this constant tension, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC exams. You see it all the time.
The development versus environment clash.
Exactly. Development pushing forward, but then this absolute need to, well, protect what we have environmentally. So today, let's do a deep dive into why this is such a critical point, hitting on stuff that's really relevant for, both mains and prelims.
It's a great starting point. That Hyderabad situation, it's like a small window onto a huge global issue, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because when we talk about protecting the environment, fundamentally, we're talking about biodiversity.
Right.
Just the sheer variety of life. It sounds a bit academic, maybe, but it's basically the engine of the planet.
Totally. Okay, so let's unpack that. What does biodiversity actually do for us? The Indian Express piece, it kind of implicitly gets at the services it provides that we just can't negotiate away.
Right. Think about nutrient cycling, how nature breaks down and reuses everything. That's biodiversity at work.
And water purification. Healthy ecosystems clean our water for free.
Exactly. And climate stability, resources for farming, for industry, even for healthcare, it all ties back.
So it's foundational.
It really is. And having that rich variety, it acts as a buffer, like insurance.
Insurance, I like that. How so?
Well, think about a farm that only grows one crop, right? A single disease could wipe it out.
Yeah, devastating.
But a natural forest with
Yeah.
tons of different species, it's much more resilient. It can weather shocks like diseases or, wildfires, floods, much better. That's biodiversity providing resilience.
That makes sense. A natural insurance policy.
Mhm.
And the report also hints at genetic diversity, right? Not just different species, but variety within a species.
Precisely. That internal variety is what allows species to adapt over time, especially with things like climate change happening. It's crucial for their long-term survival.
Okay, so if this diversity is so vital, what's threatening it? The Indian Express article points fingers mainly at us. Human activities.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the main story.
We're talking habitat destruction, obviously,
Yeah.
clearing land, often for agriculture.
Then there's pollution, air, water, soil, invasive species that push out native ones.
Urban sprawl, converting natural areas,
Mm-hmm.
and things like poaching, the illegal wildlife trade.
Mm-hmm.
There's still major problems.
And looming over all of it, you've got climate change making everything worse.
Right, it just adds pressure everywhere.
So faced with all that, the need for conservation becomes, well, undeniable.
Yeah.
And the definition the Indian Express seems to align with is pretty standard, managing how we use the biosphere so we meet our needs now, but don't mess it up for future generations.
That balancing act again. Especially tough for a country like India that's developing so fast. That context is super important for UPSC aspirants, I think.
Absolute crucial context.
And one of the interesting solutions mentioned, again, very relevant for exam prep, is this concept of biodiversity parks, part of green infrastructure.
Yes. And what's cool about these parks is the idea behind them. It's about actively restoring ecosystems,
Okay.
bringing back native plants and animals to create self-sustaining systems, often in urban or degraded areas, basically weaving nature back into places dominated by humans, improving ecological health right where people live.
And the report connects these parks directly to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as we know, UPSC loves to link things to.
Mm-hmm. It mentions SDG 2, first, zero hunger.
How does that connect?
By maintaining the genetic diversity of seeds, crops, livestock, the very foundation of our food supply, biodiversity parks can play a role in conserving local varieties.
Okay, got it. Then SDG 6, clean water and sanitation.
Right. Healthy ecosystems, like wetlands or forests restored in these parks, are natural water filters. They protect and restore water-related ecosystems.
Makes sense. And SDGs 14 and 15 are pretty direct fits, aren't they?
Absolutely. Life below water and life on land. Sustainable use of oceans, sustainable use of land ecosystems, forests, and crucially, halting land degradation and biodiversity loss. These parks are like direct action on SDG 15.
Okay, so these parks are one tool. But the Indian Express piece then zooms out to talk about broader strategies, right? In situ and ex situ conservation.
Exactly. Let's start with in situ. What's the basic idea there?
In situ, in place, basically.
Mhm.
Conserving species right there in their natural homes, protecting the ecosystems where they evolved and live.
And the report mentions specific types of areas for this, like wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. What's the difference? Key for exams, this distinction.
Good point. So wildlife sanctuaries, they focus primarily on protecting animals. Some human activities might be allowed if they don't harm the wildlife too much. National parks are generally stricter. The aim is to preserve the entire ecosystem, the natural state. Human exploitation like grazing, usually banned. Public access is often more regulated, focused on education, recreation.
And the legal backing for these?
The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 is the big one here. And the report notes, India's definitions line up with IUCN standards, the International Union for Conservation of Nature.
Good. Then there's another type. Biosphere reserves. What's different about them?
Biosphere reserves. These came out of UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program, started way back in '75. They're more holistic.
Holistic.
It's not just about strict protection. They actively try to involve local people. They usually have zones, a core area that's highly protected, a buffer zone around it for research education, maybe some tourism, and then a transition zone where sustainable development is encouraged. It recognizes people are part of the landscape.
No, a more integrated approach. People and nature working together, ideally.
Yeah, that's the idea. The article also mentions something uniquely Indian: sacred groves and lakes, that cultural angle on conservation.
Fascinating, and definitely something UPSC might touch upon.
For sure. These are places protected traditionally, often for religious reasons. Think of the sacred groves in Karnataka, Maharashtra, Meghalaya. They can be biodiversity hotspots.
It's like little refuges.
Exactly. And sacred lakes, too, like Ketchopalri and Sikkim. Protected for religious significance, but also conserving aquatic life. The report also flags conservation reserves and community reserves, newer categories under the Wildlife Act Amendment in 2002, again, emphasizing community involvement.
Okay, that covers in situ pretty well. Now, the other side of the coin, ex situ conservation. What's the main difference?
Ex situ means off-site, so preserving bits of biodiversity outside their natural habitat.
Like a backup plan.
Kinda, yeah, a safety net. If the natural home is too dangerous or gone, you can conserve the species or their genetic material somewhere else in a controlled environment.
And the report lists some ways this is done.
It does. Lots of methods. Germplasm banks or gene banks storing seeds, pollen, DNA, botanical gardens for plants, zoos, obviously, for animals. Think captive breeding programs for endangered species.
Like Nandanankan Zoo is sometimes mentioned in these contexts.
Right. Also, genetic resource centers, seed banks. The Indian Seed Vault in Ladakh is a major one. Tissue culture labs, DNA banks, cryopreservation, freezing biological stuff at super low temps, and those captive breeding programs we mentioned.
What's an advantage ex situ might have over in situ, thinking practically?
Well, space is a big one. You can often conserve a lot of genetic diversity or even keep a species going in a much smaller area than a whole national park requires.
Right.
Like the Miyawaki method. It wasn't in this specific article, but it's a relevant example used in UP, sometimes creating these super dense mini forests of native species on small plots. Shows how you can boost biodiversity in tight spaces.
Okay, so we have the on-the-ground strategies, but none of this works without the right laws and policies, right? The Indian Express highlights this too, vital for UPSC.
Absolutely essential. And India has layers of legal protection. It starts right in the Constitution.
Where specifically?
Article 48A, it's in the directive principles. It basically says the state should try to protect and improve the environment and safeguard forests and wildlife.
So a duty for the government.
Yes, but also for citizens. Article 51AG, one of the fundamental duties, says every citizen has a duty to protect the natural environment, forests, lakes, rivers, wildlife, and be compassionate to living creatures.
So responsibility at both state and individual levels.
Mm-hmm. Then you get the specific laws, the statutes. The report mentions several.
Right.
Well, they're older ones like the Fisheries Act from 1897.
Well.
But the really key ones for biodiversity today are the Wildlife Protection Act, 1972. We talked about that with parks and sanctuaries.
Right.
And critically, the Biological Diversity Act of 2002. That's a cornerstone.
Okay, the Biological Diversity Act. What led to it and what's it trying to achieve?
It came about largely because of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, from the Rio Earth Summit in '92. India signed it, ratified it in '94.
And the act translates that convention into Indian law.
Pretty much. Its main goals are threefold.
Okay.
1, conserve biodiversity. 2, make sure we use its components sustainably. And 3, ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits that come from using biological resources and the traditional knowledge associated with them. Those 3 pillars are key for UPSC.
Conservation, sustainable use, benefit sharing. Got it. And how does India plan to actually do this? There's an action plan, right? NBSAP.
Yes, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. The first version was back in 1999, updated in 2008 to match the CBD goals.
Okay.
Then it got revised again in 2014 to align with the Aichi targets. Those came out of the CBD conference in Nagoya in 2010.
So it evolves with the global agreements.
Exactly. And most recently, there's the NBSAP for 2024 to 2030. This one aligns with the Cunning Montreal framework from the latest big CBD meeting, COP15. It sets out 23 specific national targets for India.
Shows a clear commitment to keeping the strategy current and ambitious. What about other laws the report might allude to? Protecting ecosystems.
Yeah, there's a whole suite. The Indian Forests Act, 1927, and the Forest Conservation Act, 1980, both regulating forest use, trying to curb deforestation. Then there's the Forest Rights Act of 2006, recognizing the rights of forest communities, which is important for involving them in conservation.
Crucial link.
And also the Environment Protection Act, 1986. That's a big umbrella law. Plus specific rules for coasts, the Coastal Regulation Zone notification, and for wetlands, the wetland rules.
So a pretty comprehensive legal net. What about focusing on specific animals? Any projects mentioned?
Oh yeah. India is well known for its species-specific projects. Project Tiger is the classic, started way back in 73.
Still going strong.
Project Elephant from 92. More recently, you have the Snow Leopard Project from 2009, the Vulture Conservation Program trying to tackle that population crash.
Urgent need there.
Definitely. And efforts for the one-horned rhino really ramping up around 2005.
So targeted action too. And finally, the report implies India is quite involved internationally.
Absolutely. India is part of all the major agreements, the Man in the Biosphere Program, IUCN membership since '69, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, CITES, that's the one regulating trade in endangered species.
Right.
Also the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species, and India was even a founder of the Global Tiger Forum. So yeah, very active globally.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive prompted by that Indian Express piece on the Hyderabad protest, it really shows how tangled development and environment are. And for anyone studying for the UPSC, it highlights how current events connect straight into core concepts, environmental science, law, global cooperation, all vital areas.
Exactly. I think the big takeaway, especially for UPSC folks, is that balancing development and biodiversity isn't simple. It needs, well, everything we've talked about.
A multi-pronged approach.
Yeah. In situ, ex situ methods working together, strong laws backing them up, and playing our part on the world stage.
Which leads to a question for our listeners to chew on, particularly those aiming for the UPSC. We've discussed all these strategies, these laws, but what do you think is the single biggest practical challenge, the main hurdle, to actually making biodiversity conservation work effectively on the ground across a country as vast and diverse as India?
That's a good one to ponder. We really hope this discussion gave you some solid insights into this, well, incredibly important issue. Crucial for general awareness and definitely for UPSC prep.
Hope it was useful.
If you found it helpful, please do hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We'll be back with more deep dives into key topics.
And leave a comment. If you have questions or your own thoughts on the challenges of conservation, we'd love to hear them.
Definitely. And just a reminder, our jumping off point for today's conversation was that recent report in the Indian Express. Thanks for tuning in.